All right, we are recording. There should be a little red recording image next to my image or in your screen somewhere. And I will now start presenting my PowerPoint. Give me 1 second. All right, so we should now be presenting. Only if you cannot see the PowerPoint, please unmute yourself and let me know that you cannot see that I'm screen sharing. Oh. All right, so I'm going to assume everyone can see the PowerPoint. So welcome to Half the Heroes, the impact of sex and gender on SCAdian martial arts. This class has been a few years in the creation, so I'm really excited to be presenting it virtually as well and allow a larger audience to see what I've been researching over the past couple of years. So this slide has the most text, I promise, out of all of them. This presentation, we'll be discussing overarching patterns and statistically significant differences between men and women, and whether and how they matter when teaching or learning martial activities in the SCA. I do want to note at the beginning that I will not be specifically talking about transgender or intersex individuals as part of this presentation. However, transgender, detransitioned, and intersex individuals can still find a lot of this class useful or helpful when compared with their personal experiences. Keep in mind also that it's unlikely that any single person will be exactly the same as the average on every category that I'm discussing. So everyone will have to compare the information that I'm presenting to their personal experiences. Give me 1 second. Okay. So, summary of my presentation. This presentation will be discussing overarching differences between men and women and whether and how they matter when teaching martial activities in the SCA. I'll be discussing sociological differences and physiological differences. There are differences in male and female physiology, as well as different experiences in the social sphere that affect how men and women think and react to learning a new martial activity. We'll be recognizing that females and males have similarities between their physiology and similar learning abilities, and a need to recognize individual variations of the norm. I will also be suggesting some concrete changes or actions that can be done at local practices. We will be following Steve and Carol, two hypothetical people who grew up in the USA and show up to an SCA practice for the first time as young adults. Steve is male and Carol is female. So I'm going to start by defining terms. A stereotype is a standardized mental picture that is held in common by members of a group and that represents an oversimplified opinion, prejudiced attitude, or uncritical judgment. Stereotype is most frequently now employed to refer to an often unfair and untrue belief that many people have about all people or things with a particular characteristic or attribute. A stigma. A stigma is the stereotype that follows the possession of a particular attribute when that stereotype is negative or undesirable. So a stigma is always negative or undesirable. A stereotype may or may not be. Bias and unconscious bias. Bias is an inclination towards a belief, whether knowing or unknowing. Sex. The term sex generally refers to a set of biological attributes in humans and animals. It is primarily associated with physical and physiological features. Sex in humans is categorized as female or male, but there are variations in the biological attributes that comprise sex. Gender. Gender refers to the socially constructed roles, behaviors, expressions, and identities of girls, women, boys, men, and gender diverse people. Gender roles are the social norms that dictate that males are expected to possess only masculine characteristics and females are expected to possess only feminine characteristics. Statistically significant. Significant is a term that I will likely be using regularly often throughout this presentation. And this picture of two bell curves is a good indication of the patterns that we'll be talking about. We will generally be talking about the middle of the bell curves, that yellow section, showing the most frequent significant result. Statistically significant means that the pattern we're looking at is not due to random chance. For this class, the differences we will be discussing, the differences we will be talking about are correlated or caused by gender or sex. So starting with our origin story, social differences and gender roles between our characters, infancy and earlier. Parents, even when they profess to be unbiased, have been taught stereotypes and trends that they unthinkingly replicate. Unconscious bias is there even when we think it isn't. The definition of unconscious bias is that we don't notice it. Steve's parents, for instance, are more likely to place a birth announcement in the newspaper than Carol's parents are. Steve and Carol, as babies, have the same ability to crawl places, up things, down things. They have the same crawling ability. They have the same motor decisions, and they have the same attempts at crawling. But Steve's mother overestimates her baby's motor skills and crawling ability, while Carol's mother underestimates her baby's motor skills and crawling ability. Toddlers and children. So toddlers are taught that sex is an important difference between people, and this is reinforced by gender roles and stereotypes. Elementary school students are aware of stereotypes about themselves and other children, and are aware of which gender roles they're supposed to be emulating. Toddlers are taught that sex is an important difference between people, which is reinforced by color-coding toys and clothes, giving Steve and Carol different clothing to wear and toys to play with, and portraying men and women differently in books and movies. This division leads young children to emulate and reinforce gender roles and stereotypes. Children as young as 2 years old know whether they are supposed to play with certain toys based only on their sex. Children's actions are based on parents' implicit gender attitudes more than on parents' explicit gender attitudes. Even if parents say they encourage gender nonconforming behavior, Steve and Carol will pick up on how parents act when they play with the right or wrong toys. For instance, I personally was never explicitly discouraged from reading books like Goosebumps or watching TV shows like Buffy, but I knew that my parents would be upset if they saw me reading those books or watching those shows, so I'd hide in the library to read them, put them away as soon as I saw somebody coming. Even if parents raise children in as close to a gender-neutral way as possible, young children absorb information from everywhere. And all that information from the rest of the world is fit into their worldview. Their parents are only taken as authorities for gender roles if the children think that their parents are representative of the average beliefs or point of view. Elementary school students as well are aware of stereotypes about themselves and other children and are aware of which gender roles they are supposed to be emulating. Aggression and learned roughhousing are things that young boys are generally taught to be more physically aggressive and encouraged to fight when growing up. For instance, Steve is encouraged to have fistfights to solve his problems or to roughhouse for fun. Young girls, however, have been discouraged from being aggressive and have been taught that the only time they get hit or threatened is when they're in trouble. Carol, for instance, is punished for standing up for herself in a bold physical manner. This changes depending on the household and siblings of the individual. Role models in books, movies, TV shows, and video games show more physically aggressive men than women. And frequently, physically aggressive men in video games are aggressive towards women. In school as well, teachers are more likely to consider young boys to be disruptive in class and unable to concentrate, but young girls are considered better students. But teachers are more likely to call on young boys in class and allow them or ask them to talk more. So girls are considered better students, but boys are considered the experts. This thinking in elementary school contributes towards funneling boys towards traditional sports and girls towards quieter and service-oriented activities, while giving boys credit for more than they're actually doing. Teens and young adults. Gender roles are increasingly reinforced through middle and high school years. Female athletes still experience stereotypes and stigma about their participation in sports. Sports are gendered, such that boys or girls should play certain sports, for instance, gymnastics versus football. Stereotypes and stigma are reflected back on the children based on which sport they choose to play. Girls are more likely to participate in sports such as gymnastics and dance, which are less likely to be considered true sports. Boys are more likely to participate in what we consider traditional sports. Tweens and teens often reinforce these stereotypes among themselves. There'll be like macho boys being cooler and more popular, and "you throw like a girl" is a phrase that's used to bully girls in sports and boys in sports. So for instance, me personally, I was discouraged from playing with swords or playing sword games growing up, like those wrapping paper tubes that you'd hit each other with. That was like, oh, well, that's fine, but they're broken now. We're going to put them in the recycling bin. As I got older and I started learning different martial arts, I was asked, isn't that a bit violent? I was like, I mean, yeah, I'm hitting people. For young adults, female athletes still experience stereotypes and stigma about their participation in sports. Women's sports are underfunded and are perceived to be less good and less real than men's sports. And women who participate in sports are themselves stereotyped as less real women. I'm going to pause here and stop screen sharing, see if there are any questions. If there are, I'm going to check the chat here. No. If there are any questions, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. Otherwise, I'll go back to the presentation. Nope. All right. I will get back to my presentation. And I will be doing this after every section. So if there are any questions, then I'll be asking after every section and before we start the next one. So advancing the plot, walking into an SCA practice. So stereotypes and stigma. Everyone enters practice with preconceived notions about what they can and cannot do, who is allowed to do certain activities. Carol and Steve will walk into an SCA practice with a different background and different perspectives on the same activity. Informal survey data in SCA shows that on average, there are more men fighters than women fighters. Rapier has about 30% women and 70% men, whereas armored has about 4% women and 96% men. When I walked into my first rapier practice, my first fighter practice rather, is combined, I was the only woman. For years after that, at multiple practices, I was still the only woman. My thought on walking in was something like, did I belong there? Would the men accept me? I had never done sword fighting before, and I didn't know anybody else at the practice. Stereotype threat. The jargon version of this definition is that stereotype threat occurs when a population recognizes that there are large-scale expectations about their performance, and that expectation subsequently affects their performance. If I was going to say this in a mundane way, then I'd say a stereotype threat is a self-fulfilling prophecy. That somebody who is experiencing stereotype threat fulfills the expectation because they've been led to believe that it is true. The same way that people will give you what you expect of them, you're also going to give you what is expected of you simply by being reminded that those expectations exist. You're basically shooting yourself in the foot by being subconsciously reminded of stereotypes that you subconsciously believe, just by being reminded that they exist. Stereotype threat, however, can be managed or coped with in a couple different ways. You can avoid the activity to consciously or subconsciously avoid the stereotype, or you can disidentify with the target stereotyped group. A common phrase that I've heard is, I'm not like other girls. I don't like going to the mall. I don't like using makeup. I'm not like other girls. That is disidentifying with the target group. Stereotype threat can be alleviated in two different ways rather than just coped with. In-group versus out-group is one of those ways. So one way to alleviate stereotype threat using in-group versus out-group is to give individuals a new group to identify with. That is more important in that particular context to identify with that new group than the stereotyped group. Things like team pride, such as being part of a shire or barony or kingdom or household, those are all things. If you wear team colors, you fight together, you act like a cohesive group, that can help alleviate stereotype threat. So encouraging newcomers and welcoming newcomers and encouraging them to be part of your group helps combat stereotype threat. Another way to alleviate stereotype threat is to have role models and representation that oppose the stereotypes. Each additional role model alleviates stereotype threat such that there's a cumulative effect until stereotype threat is non-existent. One role model on their own won't completely alleviate stereotype threat. Multiple role models have a stacking effect and will combat stereotype threat more the more role models there are. I'll be talking more about representation later as well. We're going to pause here again. We're at the end of this section. Are there any questions? I realize the flipping back and forth is a bit bouncy. Yes.
Is there anyone else going, or can I go?
You can go. Read one.
Yeah, I'm Robert Hawksworth is my SCA name.
Robert Hawk, go for it.
What is something that we can do at practices itself? Like, especially if a new female fighter shows up, how can we make them feel more welcome if they don't know anyone, et cetera, et cetera?
So for that, I would say that how would you welcome them to your group in general? Make sure to be friendly and say, if you go out and do social things, make sure they're invited to the social things. Make sure that they're not excluded from conversations. You don't want them to be hanging out on their own. Don't let them be a wallflower. Especially females who show up to a new practice will be inclined towards being a wallflower. They're not going to want to jump in. You're going to have to bring them in. So if you have a new coworker at work, for instance, how would you include them in your kind of work culture? It's much the same type of actions and considerations of including new people at practice. And in terms of specifically fighting, do you fight as a unit when you go to events? Do you put together teams that are based on your shire, your barony, or your household? Make sure that they're invited to those teams early on. Do you have, I'm forgetting, I call them butt flags, favors that you give to, yeah, I know, you're not muted, David. And I know you. But do you have favors that you give to your members? Make sure to give those early on. Do things that would encourage, actually, I'm the seneschal of my shire, and my deputy seneschal and I have a whole class about how to include and build a productive local chapter. If you're interested, feel free to ping me on that. I see some things popping into the chat on the side. One person says, keep an eye out for your weirder members because they'll target the new women fighters in a variety of ways. If you don't know who that is, find out. That is true. Make sure that you're paying attention to how not just yourself, but especially if you are, if you're a regular. If you're a regular at practice, if you have higher level awards so that you are a, not even a peer, but like if you have a GOA, if you're known in the SCA, you have a responsibility more so than newer members to make sure that the other members are included, especially when I'm talking about martial activities and we're talking about how to include people who might otherwise be left behind.
So, sorry, Nyvein, this is David real quick. And you know where this is coming from, but how can male instructors, male senior people at practices help out? And I ask this, and you know why. because we sometimes get jumped on for helping and we sometimes get jumped on for not helping. So I want your thoughts on how best to address that.
So can I actually put that on hold and we come back to it at the end of the class?
Absolutely.
Because
absolutely.
I think some things might become clearer as I keep going. As somebody who has specifically had people specifically ask me about your class, I know where you're coming from. And I do have strong thoughts about that. But I want to put that on hold because that's not directly related to the previous two sections. So
Cool.
I'm going to ask if there are any questions for the previous two sections. And if not, I'm going to get back to the presentation. Because this can very easily devolve into a round table. I know because that's happened in every single other one of my classes. But as I am recording, I want to stay a little bit on track. But give me one. Okay, thank you. I do live in a 2-bedroom apartment, so if you see people behind me, that's why. And we are going to get back to presenting and on to the next section. So advancing the plot, we have our Steve and Carol and physiological differences between females and males. In many ways, males and females are physiologically different. Many differences can be seen from infancy or even earlier than infancy, while some differences only appear during puberty. I bring up our statistically significant graphic again to remind folks that I am talking about that average middle yellow section rather than the entire bell curve. So in this picture, which I'm going to explain first because there's a lot of things going on in it, the H on all those numbers stands for height, that all of the numbers are relative towards the height of the individual. On average, males are taller and females are shorter. Males have longer arms and legs and shorter torsos relative to their height, and females have shorter legs and longer torsos relative to their height. This is actually something that I didn't believe. I was like, no, it's totally the other way around. Women have longer legs. And I researched it, and the first study came up, and I was like, oh, that says that females have longer torsos. No, that can't be right. So I bookmarked it, and I kept researching, and it says, oh, this one also says that females have longer torsos. And 3 hours later, I was like, yeah, I've just proven myself completely wrong, and it went into my PowerPoint. So yeah, males have longer arms and legs and shorter torsos relative to their height, and females have shorter legs and longer torsos relative to their height. So if Carol and Steve are the same height, their knees, waist, and shoulders are all going to be in different locations between each other. So one takeaway is that armor in armored combat that relies on a certain distance between shoulders and waist or waist to knees is not generally going to be able to be shared between Carol and Steve. An anecdote from a fencing practice that I've been to is my friend, who is a short woman, was being taught by a tall man. And he didn't quite comprehend why she couldn't simply step in to complete this attack that he was trying to show her. And she is 2 feet shorter than he was and needed extra steps to complete the motion. If a teacher isn't paying attention, then that's something that just won't be making sense for either the teacher or the student, because that's going to change her attack significantly. Also, height and arm length can be used as cheats by tall fighters, and they might win fights early on without learning the correct skill because they're cheating. But this type of, oh, it's easy now, doesn't mean it's going to be easy across the board. That's likely to harm them later if they hit a learning plateau. Thank you. So including length and shape, male and female feet are different 93% of the time. Using shape only, they're different 85% of the time. So Carol and Steve are the same height, but Steve wears a larger shoe size than Carol. That we're used to. But Carol also has a higher arch and wider ball of her foot, making more of a triangle shape of her foot, while Steve has more surface area of his entire foot touching the ground, making more of a rectangular shape. This means that Carol naturally walks more in the balls of her feet than Steve does. Legs and knees. The Q angle is the angle at which the femur is attached to the pelvis, and this changes the force on the knees. Females have a wider Q angle than males. At baseline, female quadriceps are stronger relative to their hamstrings, whereas male quads and hamstrings are roughly equivalent whereas male quads and hamstrings are roughly equivalent in strength at baseline before starting working out without working up certain muscles. This difference is found as young as 7 years old and increases through puberty and later. So combining these two things, Carol is more likely to suffer from knee injuries due to the differences between her hips, her legs, and her knees. And this is exacerbated by poor training and posture. In order to reduce the likelihood of knee injury, Carol should warm up differently than Steve should. Steve can do Carol's warm-ups, but Carol has specific warm-ups that are better for her to be doing. Warm-ups including high skipping, running backwards, side-to-side jumps, and hip flexor stretches are things that Carol especially should be doing. Also, strengthening the muscles that help her pull her knees away from her center line will help reduce knee injuries. I believe I have a link in the notes, and if I don't, then I will add it because it used to be there, about a study on women's soccer teams and different warm-ups that reduced knee injuries on female soccer teams. Another takeaway is that Carol's feet should be placed hip width rather than shoulder width apart. Her knees should not be allowed to collapse inwards towards her body center. However, steps across the center line might feel more natural for Carol due to her Q angle. They're not physically harmful as long as her knees remain over her feet. They might not be useful or as useful as a straight step depending on what she's doing. Pelvis and hips. Male or female sex can be accurately determined 95% of the time from the pelvis alone. Femur head shape varies and contributes to the Q angle as well. Regarding the pelvis, significant differences in the pelvis between males and females can be seen even before a baby is born, such that an infant is already born with a hip angle relative to whether they're male or female. These differences are increasingly significant by 8 years old. The majority of differences grow during puberty. By age 18, a male's pelvis has completed its growth, but a female's pelvis continues to grow into early adulthood. Pause, I thought I heard someone come in to join, and I'm back. So the head of the femur contributes to the Q angle and is angled differently in different people. But the combination of pelvis and femur shape affects the angles at which Carol or Steve's legs attach to their bodies, what stances are comfortable, how to stand with a straight posture, and what angles their knees sit at over their feet. I'd like to also note, because I have a friend who's an anthropologist, that there are also racial differences that contribute to average Q angles being different between different races. However, Q angles are significantly different between male and female people across all races, so within the racial group. Hearts and lungs. Females have a smaller lung capacity per height and age than males, but males are more prone to arrhythmia, heart attacks, high blood pressure, and hypertension. Females regulate their heart rate better than males, potentially due to estrogen, although there might be other factors that are unknown at this point. One takeaway is increased training and better training plans also contribute to a better regulated heart rate, so like going for a jog every day. Working up to high levels of activity then because males are more prone to heart attacks, high blood pressure, working up to high levels of activity is more important for Steve than for Carol, since a sharp increase in exercise is more likely to contribute to Steve having a heart attack. Not that Carol can't have a heart attack, but that it's more that in terms of risk, Steve is higher risk. Elbows and shoulders. The carrying angle is really cool, but the carrying angle is the angle in which your elbow turns away from your shoulder. The images on the screen should explain that fairly well. Female elbows have a greater carrying angle than male elbows. Male carrying angle is 5 to 10 degrees on average, and female carrying angle is about 10 to 15 degrees on average. So this is why Carol, during archery, is more likely to smack the inside of her elbow with a bowstring. If that's ever happened to you, now you know why. Because her elbow literally sticks out more than Steve's does. She literally has to turn her arm more than Steve has to in order to not smack that really sensitive part inside your arm with a bowstring during archery. The carrying angle exists so that when you're walking, you don't smack your arms on your hips. That's what evolution has created a carrying angle for. So females tend to have a greater carrying angle because they have wider hips and narrower shoulders. And males tend to have a smaller carrying angle because they have wider shoulders and narrower hips. So this way, no one smacks their arms on their hips when they're walking. One takeaway for rapier is that second guard is going to be weaker for Carol than for Steve. It will also be more difficult for Carol to keep her forearms behind her behind her guard in second guard, which will result in more opponents blowing past her. Oh no, I wrote that correctly. Yeah. So basically, sometimes this is tough on virtual, I'm sorry. It'll be more difficult for Carol to keep her forearms behind her sword in second guard, which will result in more opponents blowing past her guard and hitting her wrist or arm. It creates a weaker position for her. This can be solved by Carol engaging her shoulder and back muscles appropriately. This is better for the health of her rotator cuff and her shoulder also. But if this isn't explained to her well, then she won't know why she's failing. This is also important for Steve. Steve should also be engaging his shoulders and back muscles so that he also does not kill his rotator cuff. But he won't have the negative feedback of being hit in the arm a lot or having someone blow through his guard because of his carrying angle. And he's more likely to keep doing it wrong over time and then blow his rotator cuff eventually. So that's also something to watch out for. Carol's carrying angle of her elbow, however, makes third and fourth guard in rapier pretty strong. A takeaway for armored fighters is that elbow armor for armored fighters can frequently not be shared between female and male fighters. They will fit differently and they will impact the movements and the motions that fighters are able to make. This is something I've also heard is a possibility in cut and thrust. I have not tried cut and thrust yet, so feel free to keep that in mind. Hands. Female hands are more rectangular, and they tend to have equal length index and ring fingers. That was an interesting thing that I found in studies based on disasters, natural disasters, terrorist attacks, things where they're finding people's body parts and they want to be able to identify the people. It was quite the intense research day. Male hands are more square. They tend to have longer ring fingers than index fingers. The thing to note about this is that female hands are not just smaller male hands. They're actually a different shape. This also mirrors foot differences, that female feet are not just smaller male feet, they actually have a different shape. This means that gloves and gauntlets are not unisex. If gloves don't fit well, it can cause chafing or slipping, and if gauntlets don't fit well, it can increase the instances of a finger injury. Also, rapier and cut and thrust swords are often built for men's hands. Carol might need to alter her equipment or her grip in order for the sword to feel comfortable in her hands. It might also be necessary to customize the sword handle, the pommel, or the grip so as not to cause injury and for her to feel comfortable fighting. An anecdote for myself is that I ordered a customized sword online, but I wasn't able to see the pommels because I was ordering purely online. I couldn't go into the shop to check that out. The pommel that I got with the sword was the correct weight, but it was way too big for me, and it dug into my wrist and started hurting my tendons. So had I not switched out the pommel, then I likely would have ended up with a tendon injury. However, the pommel feels perfectly comfortable to my boyfriend, who's roughly the same height as me. And that is a hand and wrist difference, that I had to switch out something that was perfectly comfortable to him. Necks. Female necks are smaller in relation to their head and body size. Male necks are larger in relation to their head and body size. This may be one factor that contributes to a higher rate of concussions in women than in men. There's also a great concussion class taught by someone in Atlanta, taught by Rochelle in Atlanta, and I do recommend that class as well when it comes around. But I'm not going to talk in depth about concussions, except that strengthening the neck muscles will help both women and men to reduce occurrence of whiplash and concussions. Also, if Carol is looking for an armored helm, she'll need to find a balance between a helm that keeps her safe and one that is too heavy and is then unsafe because it's too heavy for her to be wearing on her head and too heavy for her neck to take that weight. Steve will often be able to tolerate a heavier weighted helm than Carol. Gorgets, which is something that is used both for rapier and for armored fighters, are often created with a male model in mind. Although that guy's gorgets now has smaller gorgets. But it might be difficult for Carol to find one that fits her well. Primary versus secondary sex characteristics. This used to be called breasts versus balls. Because cups are required for male fighters, but chest protectors are not required for female fighters because they're not equivalent body parts. All of you probably know this. The people who don't know this are probably not taking my class. But I have been told that a nipple shot for a woman hurts just as much as the dick shot on a man. And I should never have been told that. That's not true and also weird. Don't say that ever. They're not equivalent body parts. They don't have equivalent sensitivities, and they should not be equated, especially when giving advice for armor. Just don't. Breasts vary in size and sensitivity depending on the woman. So regardless, women who have large breasts are used to living with them. They're attached to their body. Breasts do not unbalance women, which is something my friends have heard. They're a normal body part that a woman is used to living with. So Carol in rapier may choose to wear or to not wear a chest protector. Carol should be allowed to decide whether a chest protector is right for her since she's the expert on her body. If Carol needs to alter her rapier guard positions due to her breasts, let her tell you what movement and angles works for her and feels the most comfortable. You should explain the outcome and the angle that is the goal of the movement. Explain the technique and the mechanical advantages of the move, and work with Carol in order to find an equivalent movement that does the same thing or something that has the same outcome, even if it's a different movement. Even in armored fighting, Carol's boobs won't get in her way. I have been told that during a flat snap, she should rotate her core in the direction of the strike so that her boobs should be moving away from her as her arm swings. And so I'm going to let someone in. I'm not letting anyone in. Okay. And we're back. All right. Give me 1 second. I hear. All right. Letting someone in and we're back. Flexibility and agility. Strength, speed, and balance. Female bodies are more flexible than male bodies. But just because Carol can do a certain move doesn't mean that it's ideal or optimized for her body, and it doesn't mean that it won't create injury later on. So early on when I was learning Capoferro and I was learning the Capoferro lunge, I thought it was impossible because the way I was trying to do it was incorrect. That I was leaning closer to the I'm a little teapot than the pulling your shoulders forward and hinging at the hips. But once the lean was explained in more detail, I was able to do it correctly and not hurt myself. Prior to this, I was throwing out my back because I was able to be flexible in that direction, but it was not the smart thing to do and not the thing that I should have been doing in rapier. The men in the class, however, were doing the lean correctly via instinct and being able to emulate the instructor. Agility. Agility includes strength, speed, and balance. Women have better balance while men have better strength. Balance might be a factor of foot shape, flexibility, and center of gravity. Strength is a factor of muscle type and muscle growth. There are a few agility drills that I know for rapier. There's a glove drill where you drop, where instead of, you're working on the lunge, and the instructor holds out 2 gloves and drops them at varying intervals based on, in order to train you to lunge based on the motion and not based on the motion cue rather than just a drill without looking at anything. Sorry for tripping over myself there. And the tennis ball drill is one that's my favorite. Normally I show these in class, so it's weird to do it virtually. A tennis ball drill is where you take a tennis ball and you drop it on the ground and you have to lunge to catch it. Both of those, I will figure out how to explain better in the future. Moving on to endurance. Females resist muscle fatigue better than males. Males have better endurance at short intervals, but females have better endurance at long intervals. Such as male sprinters having better times than female sprinters, but female super marathon runners having better times than male super marathon runners. So one possible takeaway for this is that Carol might enjoy melees more than Steve because she's better equipped for melee fighting. So you want to be careful not to disparage melee fighting as worse than tournaments, even though it is a different type of fighting with different styles of goals. Muscle strength. So males tend to have larger muscle fibers than females, which corresponds to larger muscles or overall, which corresponds to strength. Males have more lean fiber in their upper bodies, corresponding with greater upper body strength. Male and female lower body strength is more similar, but still not the same. Males still have a higher muscle strength from baseline. Again, we're talking about from baseline, not from have you trained. The rate of muscle gain. Carol can, however, gain muscle at a faster rate than Steve can, relative to their body sizes. So Steve starts with a baseline of more muscle than Carol, but Carol can gain muscle at a faster rate. Again, Carol and Steve are more similar in strength than Couch Potato Jack and Couch Potato Jill, as additional examples. Steve will be stronger than Carol if they train similarly, but Carol is going to be stronger than Couch Potato Jack. So as a takeaway for the SCA, in armored fighting, Steve will be able to hit harder more easily than Carol. Carol will have to use proper posture in order to hit harder. Muscle memory of size is actually a similarity. Muscles have memory of a sense. So if you once upon a time had more muscle mass and then you lost it, then it'll be easier for you to regain that same amount of muscle mass than if you never had it to begin with. Rebuilding muscle is easier than building muscle the first time. This is the same for males and females. But if we remember from the first part of this presentation, Steve and Carol did not do sports equally when they were younger. So Steve did sports when he was younger. It will be easier for him to build muscle faster than Carol, who is discouraged from doing sports and thus didn't build muscle when she was younger. And my miscellaneous slide, all the small things. Sex hormones and hormonal cycles are a big part of things, but we are just touching on them briefly. Females and males actually have the same hormones, but they have different proportions of them, and they have different hormone receptors and different hormone cycles. One thing that's of note is that testosterone increases muscle size, but not the number of muscle fibers. Estrogen decreases inflammation and recovery time of muscles. For hormonal cycles, female hormonal cycles are monthly, unless they're on hormonal contraceptives, which we are not talking about here. And male hormonal cycles are daily, with testosterone generally being higher in the morning, although there's some research that suggests that testosterone fluctuates seasonally as well and is higher in spring and summer and lower in fall and winter. Menstrual cycle tracking for female athletes can be beneficial to performance, since there's some suggestion that different types of training are more effective at different points in the cycle. Also, different nutrition is necessary and more useful for training at different points in the cycle. For example, making sure that Carol eats enough calories during various points of her menstrual cycle is helpful, because there's some research that has shown that women are just as effective athletes across their entire menstrual cycle as long as they're receiving the appropriate amount of calories. As long as their body is receiving proper nutrients, then the menstrual cycle will not affect them except on an individual basis. If you're looking for an app, if you're not on a contraceptive and you're a female with a menstrual cycle who's looking for a tracking app, Fitter Woman, FITRWOMAN, is a good tracking app for sports because it gives information about nutrition and workouts that are better or worse at different points during the menstrual cycle. Another thing to take note of is be aware of period jokes and of reducing the menstrual cycle to quips about emotions. That is super common in our culture, and that stigmatizes menstruation. Immune response. So female bodies have a stronger immune response than male bodies. This is good for diseases. For instance, it's good during the disease that's currently going around that everybody knows about. But while this is good for diseases, it contributes to possibly worse allergies. And considering all of the SCA's events, or not all of them, a great number of SCA events are outdoors, this is just something to keep in mind. Crying is a physiological response. Is something that has been talked about a bunch and requested that I put into this class. I did a little research, and my conclusions were that, especially in rattan, so Carol is more likely to automatically start crying during or immediately following a fight where full speed and strength are used. This is likely to be physiological and psychological as a reaction to leftover cortisol in her system that needs a release, and to the gender role stereotypes that's been ingrained into her psyche that she's fighting. However, it might also be a response to having a concussion. So it's important to pay attention to your friends and note what is normal or abnormal for them. And you first, if Carol starts crying, then you first want to do a quick check to make sure that she's not injured. Find out what just happened to make sure that she didn't just get a concussion. But if everything is okay and it's a psychological reaction and not a concussion, then she already has effort to, she already wants to stop crying, and you don't want to make it more awkward. So, hey, are you okay? If she says, sure, she's fine, then take her at her word. She's fine. Don't bring notice to it. Don't bother her. She'll be fine. She'll get back on her feet on her own and participate at the level where she feels comfortable. You don't want to make her feel more awkward or more embarrassed by calling attention to her crying in what is generally a public space. And you don't want her to have to manage your feelings if she's by calling her out and increasing the amount of awkwardness in the situation. Similarities are generally taught fairly well. They're addressed fairly well in training and instruction. Posture, however, is something that is a similarity that is really, really important. So for good posture, you want to have a neutral spine and pelvis, your core engaged, your chest raised, shoulders rolled back, and chin lifted to neutral. Constantly rounding your shoulders can result in back problems. And most of us sit at a desk during the day. And sitting at a desk, you're likely to slouch and you're likely to roll your shoulders forward and give yourself posture problems that will then be exacerbated by doing rapier or armored fighting. Instead, so if you look at the picture on the right of the guy who has two flattened, two arched, and natural curves, you want to keep the natural curves in your spine, but kind of elongate yourself. One concept for doing this is picturing a string going straight through the middle of your head, all the way down your spine, and like a marionette being pulled straight in order to have straight posture. Posture is important for armored and rapier fighters. For armored fighters, women need to have good posture in order to deliver a hit with enough force and to block a hit without losing their balance or injuring themselves. All right, section end. And are there any questions? I see some questions in the side chat. I see possibly an explanation in the side chat. Are there any questions that I should be addressing? Nope. Okay. Everyone's shaking their heads. I mentioned second guard being weaker for women in rapier. Yeah. So this is something that is much easier to show in person, unfortunately, and so I'm gonna do my best to without. So basically, when I stick my arm out, my elbow, you cannot see this at all. Cool. No, don't worry about it. When I stick my arm out, and I'm trying to get a straight line, my sword down through my arm, my elbow wants to cock out. My elbow wants to create an angle that feels really awkward if I'm just sticking my arm out straight and not engaging my shoulders and not engaging my back. Then I am creating more of an angle than is. I'm creating a bad angle. I'm creating a weaker angle if I just stick my arm out and don't roll my shoulders back with good posture and basically create a better angle. What feels natural to me is not actually the best posture because we're so used to curling forward, we're so used to slouching that I'm not used to engaging my upper back and shoulder muscles, so that in order to have the correct angle and not have a weaker second guard, then I have to do something that feels unnatural at first because I'm so used to sitting at a desk, and I'm so used to typing at my computer. So, and that's because of the natural alignment of my bones. Whereas the same thing is actually true for men, but it won't be as visible. That a lot of fighters are not engaging their back and are not engaging their shoulder muscles. But for men, the for men, one of the likely scenarios is that they're actually going to blow their shoulder out before they get feedback in a fight that tells them that they're doing it wrong. If that made sense. I see some head nodding. I see some more questions popping in. Yeah, left-handed introduces other complications that I'm not going to talk about, which aren't complications really, because I fight a bunch of lefties at practice, and but a lot of it can be, but a lot of things that you're like, oh, personally, I am doing something like bad personally, can actually be. I lost track of my sentence there. I'm sorry. Okay, what's the next question? Moving on.
Okay. I do have a question. It was actually asked by my boyfriend. It's a clarity thing. So when you say cocking your elbow out, you're referring to when we extend our arm, how on the inside our elbow extends?
So well, let me pin myself. Let's see if I can do this better. Oh, hello. Okay. I cannot see any of you now. Okay, can you all, maybe this might just be for me. You can pin me to your screen. So let's see if I can.
Yeah.
So you see that kind of like bump there of my arm? That's the top of my arm. My elbow here is similarly sticking out a bit, that if I were to do archery, I would smack myself right there.
It was the terminology of cocking the elbow out.
Oh, yeah. So
that's the inside of our body.
So for rapier, I really want to relax my arm and create and get rid of that angle. So this is straight. And I really want, if I have my shoulders forwards, I really want to relax my arm, which creates, you see how my elbow is sticking out on this side now. So that's creating a target that feels comfortable to me when I'm holding my sword, but is creating this additional target here. Versus, this is really tough in my desk position, but if I'm going to have proper posture, and you can totally see that I'm not wearing garb under my hood, if I have proper posture and I pull my arm back, then I now have a straight arm without my elbow sticking out. So okay. So what I want to do with my shoulders forward is I'm creating this angle here, but if I pull my shoulders back and engage the correct muscles, then I'm actually straightening out that angle.
Okay, no, thank you. That was it was just a clarity on terminology, but that was fantastic. Thank you so much.
This is also incredibly difficult in virtual setting. Are there any other questions, or anyone want to jump in with an additional explanation for that?
Do you want an assist, Nyvein?
Only if there's still confusion, or if you would like to clarify something you think that you want to throw in a clarification for something I said.
Just a couple things. So one, what you're talking about, I've got a video for that on the Tattersall DC site about trying to pull your shoulders back into your sockets, because men, as you say, have stronger muscles. They can extend that arm and hold it out there better. So, but as my physical therapist has taught me, you want that muscle, you want that shoulder back in that socket. Be quiet, cat. I'm sorry.
I love your cat.
She's a little loud. But yeah, so what you're getting at is you don't want to extend that arm outside your socket and hold it. You want to keep it back inside your socket. And I've got a video that gets at that on my Tattersall DC site, which is what I was training you guys to do as well, on trying to maintain the strength through the back muscles, through the shoulder and back muscles.
Can you throw the link into the side chat here?
Yeah, I'll go find it.
Any other questions, or I will get back to the last section in the presentation, or close to last section. Nope. Okay. We're going to get back to screen sharing. And so the hero's journey, the first year and onwards. So remember, we talked about previous experience. Some psychological concepts can be found in other sports, as can social issues caused by participating in those sports. These issues that I'm discussing are not unique to the SCA, and they're things that folks may have learned or learned coping skills for previously. Physical motions and movement can also have a foundation in other sports or martial arts, making learning new martial arts easier or more difficult. Girls who have participated in traditional sports or in martial arts are more likely to already have contended with stereotype threat and probably already have coping mechanisms in place. Physical motions and movement that have a foundation in other sports are things that both boys and girls who participate in other sports are more likely to know how their bodies move and work. When asking about prior sport participation, remember that gymnastics and dance are just as relevant as things like baseball and football, but they're things that are less likely to be categorized as sports. So if you ask the general question, have you done sports before? You might get a no, even if someone has done dance or gymnastics or cheer. Assumption of skill and self-confidence. So regardless of true skill level, men tend to assume they have a greater skill level for masculine coded abilities, and women tend to assume they have a lesser skill level for masculine coded abilities. Men tend to be overconfident when participating in masculine coded abilities, and women tend to be underconfident when participating in masculine coded abilities, regardless of true skill level. This assumption is created by socialization and gender roles. These differing assumptions mean you have to change how you interact with Steve or Carol. Steve might be overconfident and might need to be shown how new of a fighter he really is. He often has to be shown rather than told how new he is. However, once Steve realizes how little he actually knows, he might need encouragement to not quit, because we're not trying to make anyone quit here. And he might need encouragement for when he realizes how much it's going to take to actually improve. Social stigma, which is enforced for Steve as well, might make him self-conscious for not living up to masculine stereotypes. He needs to know that he's on a normal trajectory, and he needs to be able to receive support from other men without platitudes like, oh, you're really good at that, because he's feeling like he isn't. He needs to know what his trajectory actually looks like. Carol, on the other hand, might need encouragement to start fighting and not let herself be overlooked. She already assumes she knows nothing, so this doesn't need to be drilled into her head. She might need encouragement. From other women fighters so that she doesn't fall prey to stereotype threat. And relating the new skills she's trying to learn with other physical activities she's done in the past could help. So dance and rapier fighting look very different if you're coming in with a surface level view. But my dance background has been one of the most beneficial things to me learning rapier and understanding how the movements work, how my body works, and how to move with an opponent than other physical activity I've done. So I have a few drills. These are drills I love to use with new fighters. So in rapier, I don't know precisely how this would work for armored. So the attacking drill for someone who's hesitant to hit other fighters. This can be either a new female fighter who is hesitant to hit because she's afraid of hurting her opponent, because in her worldview experience, you only hit people as a last resort. Women are often in self-defense classes are told basically that physical fighting, roughhousing is not a thing, roughhousing for fun. Fighting is done for self-defense. You only hit when you're past angry, when you're afraid for your safety. So a new female fighter is more likely to worry about harming her opponent, who's her friend. She's joining this social club and she's friends with the person she's hitting, and then she has to hit them and not hurt them. A new male fighter might be hesitant to hit a girl This is actually something that has happened, that a new fighter in my practice showed up and he was working with other male instructors, and it came my turn around to help him, and I was like, okay, what have you been working with? What have you been working on? What have you been doing? And he was like, oh yeah, I'm good at XYZ. This is what I've been doing. I don't really like hitting girls though. And I went, well, here I am in luck, because that's really dangerous for him. In order that we're in the SCA, we're in a co-ed sport. He has to be able to attack an opponent safely, regardless of who that opponent is. So for attacking, someone who is hesitant to hit other fighters, you want to give them a sword, and assuming that you are an instructor with a higher level of skill than the person that you are teaching, it's my baseline assumption here, you have no sword and they have a sword. You want to have them try and attack you while you are parrying with your hand. But you have a win condition, because you want this to feel like a game, not like you're babying someone. Although you might have to work up to this point. You might have to start with having them hit you while you're standing still, hold your hand out, and work up to the point of moving together at not full speed. Work up to full speed if you feel that is safe, always wearing masks. But you have a win condition. Your win condition is to tap them on the shoulder. Their win condition is to hit you in a proper attack, paying minimal attention to posture, and other things that could be injuries, because you're trying to work through a psychological issue here. So you have a win condition, so you can win, which means that they don't have to worry about you having a sword. They don't have to worry about two things happening at once. All they're worrying about is hitting you, but it's a challenge, and they have a goal that feels like a game. Defending is the same thing, just backwards. Using the defending drill for someone who is uncomfortable being hit or needs to work on their parries. Again, new female fighters are more likely to flinch on being hit. They're less used to roughhousing. So that is something that is also a problem for their safety in a fight. And you want to start off really, really slowly, and you take away their sword. If you're doing both drills, I always suggest doing the attacking drill first, because it feels safer. That they know what's going to happen, and they have the weapon to begin with, and then they're like, okay, I know how this works. Then you take away their sword, and you have a sword, and you start off very slowly, and they have a win condition. They have the same win condition, which is to get past your sword to tap you on the shoulder. So again, it's a challenge and a goal, and your win condition is to hit them like you would in a fight. And you want to make sure you do hit them occasionally. You don't let them get past you all the time, but you also let them get past you occasionally, in order for them to feel comfortable working across distances and being able to close on their opponents and not being terrified of the sword that you're holding. But splitting those two things apart helps so that this new fighter doesn't have to focus on too many things at once. My next point, that teachers make the same mistake as students, is about biases. Teachers have the same biases as their students. So a teacher might assume that Carol is less competent than Steve if Carol and Steve are actually at similar skill levels. Selection bias means teachers are more likely to see what they believe, giving Carol a higher bar to reach than Steve in order to be considered good enough. Regarding, again, assumption of skill and self-competence. But then in regards to the authority of the teacher, Carol, as a teacher, will be seen as a less competent teacher than Steve. However, our random John Doe is even more likely to see Carol as less competent, and our random Jane Doe is less likely to see Carol as less competent. Because in general, a woman will be seen as less competent than a man. However, a man is even more likely to see a woman as less competent than a man. If Carol is teaching John Doe, she might have to prove her competency and authority with more force and repetition than if she were teaching Jane Doe. If Carol is teaching John Doe and she proves that he's overconfident, He might then need encouragement from other men in the group so as not to be discouraged and lose motivation. Again, based on all of our stereotypes and stigma that are floating around in our entire society and not just in the SCA. And we're not trying to kick people out as long as they are good people, just because they are being mentally hit by stereotypes and stigma. Stereotypes and stigma come up in language. Gendered insults and sexist jokes are things that make a big difference. For example, I personally was the only woman at a fighter practice that I was with my friends. These were all my friends. I knew everybody there. More friends, less friends. You know, maybe I'd go out for coffee with some of them, and maybe others I'd invite over to my house, but I knew everybody. I was talking to a friend of mine about planning an event, about planning rapier melee at an event, and the conversation naturally lulled. And you know how you can always, or there's always that one conversation that you suddenly hear a sentence of when everything else gets quiet and you're all like, oh, what was that? Well, in this case, the conversation behind me used a female slur as part of a funny story. And it made me stop and realize that I was the only woman at that fighter practice. Prior to that, I hadn't noticed because these were my friends. It was that in-group versus out-group. The group that was more important was the local SCA chapter that I was at a fighter practice for. But then that slur made me realize that I was the only woman there. Gendered insults and sexist jokes can increase the occurrence of stereotype threat because stereotype threat is triggered by noticing the differences and stereotypical deficiencies in the target population. Childcare and free time at home and in the SCA. I'm going to pause, and I would like you all to think, how many women with children do you know who fight in the SCA? How many men with children do you know who fight in the SCA? You don't announce it. I'm just going to pause for a little bit, and I want you to count up in your head. How many women and how many men who have children also fight in the SCA? When I do the count, there is a lot more men with children who fight in the SCA and a lot fewer women. Something else to consider is who sews the clothes in the SCA, who beautifies camp, who cooks and packs the food. These are all things that matter, that change interactions and change how we interact and how much time we have in the SCA to do different things. Representation. Said I'd be talking about this again. 13% of mods, Masters of Defense, across the entire SCA are women. 87% are men. In Armored, there have been 14 queens or princesses by right of arms in the entire history of the SCA. There have been 1,224 kings by right of arms. With the understanding that this is not nice, this is kings and queens, because that data was easier for me to pull out. Women have won crown 0.01% of the time. However, the same percentage of women who win crown, as women who become knights. Whereas for men, more men become knights than win crown. In essence, it is easier for a man to become a knight than win crown, which we would assume, but it is just as difficult for a woman to become a knight as it is for her to win crown. So why does there seem to be a glass ceiling for women in rapier and rattan? Why are there proportionally fewer women peers for rapier and armored? And what contributes to this gap? Carol and Steve's trajectories over the long term help to explain this. Carol is not conforming to gender roles, and she may be punished for doing so, either by herself or by being ignored by higher level fighters, because the assumption, not that outright, no one said this out loud, but the assumption is that she's not as good as Steve. In addition, Carol has received poor physiological instruction for her body type since a greater number of instructors are male. Carol has few role models that she can look up to, ask for advice, and see herself emulating. Carol is likely to get better slower than Steve and be dismissed because she's getting better slower. If Carol does get to be as good as Steve, she'll be viewed as less competent because she's a woman participating in a masculine activity, and therefore the bias is that she is less competent, and so she'll have to be even better than Steve in order to be considered as good as Steve. Steve, on the other hand, is conforming to gender roles. He's rewarded for doing so by increasing confidence and by being noticed by higher level fighters. In addition, Steve has received better physiological instruction for his body type. Steve has role models that he can look up to, ask for advice, and see himself emulating. Steve is likely to get better faster than Carol and be praised for doing so. So what can we bring home? Everyone is a chatelaine is a phrase that we hear a lot. But it's something that we can do when a newbie walks into practice. You can encourage a newcomer to try all the things. Don't just talk about the things that you like best. And if someone says, I can't, without a physical disability, if someone says, I can't, rather than I don't want to, you might want to reconsider your explanation of the activity. Give examples of people like them who are doing the thing they think they can't do. I've had quite a few newcomer women walk into practice and I'm like, yeah, here's all the options. And I do rapier fighting. Look at swords, aren't they cool? And they've said, oh, I can't. I don't have good enough hand-eye coordination. And I was like, that's odd. So it's like, but swords are cool. Yeah. Hey, why don't you come try this? Here, I'll just show you this and the other thing. And they were really excited and got really into it. And they are now rapier fighters. But their first assumption was that they can't do the thing, not that they don't want to do the thing. Tournaments for new fighters. You want to make sure that new fighters have the chance to compete in other people in their skill bracket. The novice tournament at Penzic is really good for this because they also give out prizes proportional to winning. Giving out prizes proportional to winning helps encourage everybody to join a tournament, not just higher level fighters, that newcomers feel like there's something in it for them and that they get something out of it. If you just give prizes to the top fighters, then that discourages it can discourage newcomers from entering in a tournament because why bother? Giving out prizes proportional to winning encourages new fighters to enter especially large tournaments. Large tournaments where they'll have a chance to fight against a greater variety of opponents and gain better skill, but they're unlikely to win a large tournament. Be clear and articulate when giving advice. Explain why you want fighters to do something, not just what you want them to do. This helps that if a fighter can't do something exactly as you are explaining it, that they don't have to just emulate you, that they understand why they're supposed to be doing something, and you can work with them to create a movement or a motion that is better for their body and their body type. Also, please do not use the word aggressive when explaining how someone should get better at fighting. This word is extremely misused in the SCA. This is one of my pet peeves. Aggressive is overused and misused so much in the SCA. It is not precise, and it is not easy to understand as a new fighter. There are more precise, and there are easier to understand words and terminology that can be used instead. Drills and slow practice is also incredibly important. You don't want to just throw new fighters into a shark pit. While drills are important for learning and expertise, remember to change up the drills and suggest drills that are more fun or fight-like to keep people engaged in the atmosphere. But also remember that many people, women especially, don't have much free time at home. If you're suggesting take-home drills, suggest things that only take 5 to 10 minutes and can be done without a partner. So in conclusion, thank you all for coming to my class. And my class handout is available on the tiny URL. If you are wary of tiny URLs, then I'm happy to post the full Google Doc link. The bibliography is available on the slide. It is also linked off of the handout. You don't have to worry about copying it down. It includes 160 plus sources, and feel free to contact me at my email. If you don't feel like reading 160 plus sources like I've done, then I have pulled out some recommended reading books. My top recommended book is not specifically relevant to the SCA. It's called Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men by Carolyn Criado Perez. This book is incredibly comprehensive and it is very new. And it explains the ways that we have overlooked and not done or explained research on women as compared to men, and differences between women and men in our society. It talks about similarities and differences in regards to both gender and sex. Fear is the Mind Killer by Kaya Sadowski is also incredibly recommended. I'm actually still reading through it. I'm almost done reading through it. This is something that has been recommended by friends of mine. I know it's been recommended all over the place. This is great for SCA practice. It is written, Kaya is a HEMA instructor, and it explains has a lot of similar things to what I've talked about, and it explains how to create an inclusive practice and goes more into depth in some things and other things. Delusions of Gender by Cordelia Fine talks about neuroscience and talks about how sexism in their neuroscience research and industry has contributed to concepts of pink brains and blue brains. And it brings up a lot of neuroscience. Again, a very well-researched book with an entire bibliography in the back. The Science of Yoga by Anne Swanson is, at this point, it's my favorite book that explains physiology. It is about yoga. Yoga is also something that if you're looking to kind of up your physical exercise and movement, and kind of yoga has multiple levels that you can come in on a very easy level and work your way up. Yoga helps you understand and conceptualize how your body works. And The Science of Yoga by Anne Swanson has great pictures, great graphics. Is one of the few books that talks about physiology that I've seen where it actually does show differences between male and female physiology, not across the entire book, in kind of a few key places. And the pictures are great. It's easy to understand. You don't have to have a degree in anything to understand what she's talking about. And if you do yoga, it's really super useful because it explains how you should be standing for good posture in all the different positions. So despite me using Marvel characters as my example characters in this entire presentation, the inspiration for the title of this presentation actually came from Tamara Pierce, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. She is a writer, and she has a quote. She is one of the first fantasy authors that wrote about female protagonists. Her quote is that girls are 50% of the population. We deserve to represent 50% of the heroes. I am going to keep recording for any questions that come up. I see a bunch of numbers in the chat. Okay, we have just some chatter in the chat, looks like. Are there any questions for my presentation? I know, Erin, you asked a question earlier. I'll get to that if there aren't any immediate.
I do have a question.
Yes.
How can we best support those female fighters who come in and in their first few fight practices are told, well, you'll become a better fighter if you sleep with so-and-so, or if you date so-and-so?
Wow.
Wow.
I had a great couple of first few practices.
That's a hard question. The reason it's a hard question is because it's not an easy answer, because the answer should be something like, well, somebody should not be saying that to begin with. How is that even something that's said, right? That's something that is a problem within the larger culture that I'm not sure has a snarky comeback to it, to be perfectly honest. Because what you should be telling them is that something like, because the problem is, what you want to tell them is the SCA isn't like that. You want to say, we're not like that. You don't have to worry about that. But somebody who's going to say you have to sleep with so-and-so in order to get an award, there may be other issues, right? Like there are maybe other issues that are going on that that person thinks that way, that there are other people that should not still be in the SCA that are still in the SCA. Like there are layers of problems that go into a comment like that. So I'm hesitant to be like, oh yes, here's your single response. Because the best answer that I have is to honestly be like, don't worry about that person. They don't know what they're talking about. And to include the newcomer more in your social circle, because it's a social comment. So you want them to feel socially accepted, not singled out, not pressured in a social sexual harassment manner. And that is a larger, is there a sexual harassment problem in your chapter or your group that you have to deal with? Like, is that true at all? Or is that person who said that comment really just an asshole? Or is that person who said that comment really truly believe that because they've seen some really terrible things go down? And in that case, the explanation would be, we are dealing with our terrible things, just like a lot of the world is. And we are trying to make fewer of them happen in the future. And we're trying to make not terrible things happen. So I think that's, if that kind answers, I think that's kind of like, it's very context heavy.
Yeah, I think that's the best answer you could have given considering the question. But I have noticed in a lot of discussion groups that is a really common thing, especially for female fighters, is they're encountering individuals who want inappropriate relationships in order to give them training or for them to be advanced. And that's not just in one group. I've seen that across the board.
That's something, as a problem, if that is something that the instructor is saying that in order to get training, the new fighter has to sleep with them, that should be something that should be reported up through the seneschal chain and the night marshal chain, if that is actually a problem that is happening. And as high as you have to go in order to get a response, in order for someone to listen. If that is something that is happening, and if the newcomer comes to you and says, hey, this person is pressuring me, then you can walk them through reporting. You don't have to be like, hey, this is how you report, go talk to the seneschal, and then they don't know the seneschal and they're uncomfortable and you don't want to talk to this person. You can help them write a report. You can help them send a report. You can skip your local group seneschal. So I'm a local group seneschal. You can skip, for instance, me. If you have a problem with me, and you can go up to my regional, you can go up to kingdom, you can go straight to the top of the society. And that is a perfectly appropriate response for something that you are worried about, or worried about not getting a response in a lower part of the chain.
Okay. Thank you.
So any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Hi. So first, that was fascinating. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I wanted to ask, we follow the narrative of the new female fighter who's never had exposure to the SCA before coming in and her experience. What about those of us that say move across kingdoms, and you have maybe a little more experience and you show up to a new practice, you don't know people, and you have to deal with that implicit bias of maybe you don't know as much as you do, even though the fighter is clearly maybe more experienced, and you have to kind of go through that period of proving that you're not to be underestimated.
So that's great. I've moved across kingdoms. I've actually lived in 3 different kingdoms. I did not fight in the first kingdom I lived in. I fought in Atlantia and I fought in Drachenwald. And then I came back to Atlantia. Moving is difficult. Like no matter at who you are and what groups you're moving between, there's always a lot of, you have to work your way into a new social group. In the SCA, I found it a little easier because you don't have to build a new group from the beginning. But from the fighter's perspective, I'm going to answer from the fighter's perspective and from the instructor's perspective. So from the fighter's perspective, I would say try and keep your confidence up, that you know what your experience has been, you know what your background is, and you might have to take a little longer to integrate yourself into the group than you really want to, and that you hope to do. But I think that a social integration would probably help at that point, not just a like tournament winning type of integration, not just say, hey, I beat you in a fight, but people, when you get down to individual people and personalities, if you're friends with someone, you're more likely to give them the benefit of the doubt for all sorts of things. So social integration, rather than just trying to beat people at fights, is probably something that is, if you're going to prioritize what you do at practice, then it sounds counterintuitive to say, hey, maybe chat with folks a little more than just being out there on the floor fighting. But I think that would be my recommendation, is early on, make sure you're chatting with folks, make sure you're saying hi, that as a newcomer, try and not be the wallflower. I personally am very inclined towards being a wallflower. And is definitely, I understand how difficult it is to get out there and to chat with people. But that social integration will also help you as the new fighter, because then you're not, because then you feel part of that group. So if there was going to be a stereotype threat that you are combating, feeling integrated in that group socially is also going to help you combat that stereotype threat. From an instructor point of view, then I would say don't try not to make assumptions, right? A lot of my presentation talks a lot about these are assumptions that people make, and these are things that we do to kind of combat those assumptions. But try not to make assumptions. If somebody new comes in, don't just assume right off the bat that they are new to the SCA. I've definitely made that mistake before, and it's kind of embarrassing as an instructor. I've definitely made that mistake where somebody who was a transplant from another area had been out of rapier for a really long time, so I totally thought she was new based on a lot of different factors, was not new, and was a transplant, and had done it before, and I was incredibly embarrassed to have assumed that she was a new person. But asking questions like, oh, hey, ask somebody if they are in the SCA, ask somebody, hey, you know, what was your favorite activity in your prior kingdom? What did you do in your prior kingdom? Kind of like that same getting to know you type of thing. But make sure to also ask questions that lead towards the implicit skill level of things, so that you don't assume that they know nothing when they do have experience.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you for the question. Are there any other questions? I see some chat questions floated up here. How can we support Carol better to stay encouraged at her skill level while she is getting better more slowly than Steve? We have extra support in tournaments for newbie levels. Where Carol gets discouraged is a mid-level, and there are now tournaments that would be more encouraging for her level. It's either novice tournaments or the deep pool. Oh, there are not tournaments for a mid-level, I think is what that question is asking. So my first response to that would be, why not creating tournaments for mid-level? If you have an So creating tournaments for mid-level, you can define that mid-level in a variety of different ways, depending on your kingdom. If you have an academy system, if you do not have an academy system, I'm sure you have a variety of, like the cadet tourney at Penzic tries to define that mid-level to create a tournament for that kind of missing level, which I believe the question is asking about. But supporting Carol to stay encouraged at her skill level while she is getting better more slowly than Steve. So some of that is, I think, a lot of the issues that I have talked about impact new fighters the hardest, but do continue to impact fighters as they go along. So having maybe somebody who is at a mid-level had early instruction that was very poor, going back over basic posture, but not making it a thing that's like, oh, well, you suck at your basic posture, so we're going to review posture. Something that Erin Harper, who is laughing at me, does really well is going back over the basics and saying, hey, we all need to relearn the basics and we all need to review this, but also because you learn them at a basic level when you first start. And then as you get better, you want to increase the complexity of how you think about those things that are very basic, become less basic as you get better. Also, something as instructors and higher level fighters and folks in polling orders can consider is what are their personal requirements and assumptions in order to achieve the award that they are participating in giving advice for and giving advice often for the royals to give out the award. What are your biases? That when Carol is in that mid-level, is she actually doing worse than the equivalent Steve? Or do you have a bias that you're fighting subconsciously where you think Carol is doing worse than Steve, but she's actually doing just as good as Steve? That's something that folks who are in polling orders, because they give advice for what awards get given out, or even if you're writing awards in, anyone can write in a recommendation for an award. Who do you recommend for awards? Who do you recommend for your AOA level awards? Are you recommending more Steves than Carols? Are you recommending more Steves and Carols because the Steves are better, because there are more Steves, or because you are overlooking the Carols? I think that the question about helping Carol along is also something that is not just a helping Carol question, because maybe Carol doesn't need the help. Maybe you need the help to view Carol differently. So that was a bit of a heavy answer there. Does anyone have any questions about either that answer of mine, if whoever wants to clarify if their question was asking something a little different, or any other questions?
I had a question going back to the training and the drill, and
Yes.
I don't know if I'm asking this the right way, but a lot of the things that we try to teach in training through the drills are more complex activities, like measure and timing, or what a guard and second looks like. And a lot of the physiological differences you were discussing seem to come in at a more basic level, like agility and balance and strength. So as an instructor, I need to take that into consideration when I'm doing conditioning drills. How much of an issue is it going to be when I'm doing drills that focus on a specific technique? Would a female fencer need to learn second differently from a male fencer, or measure or timing, or those things?
That's a great question. Okay, I think I see what you're asking. So the question to me sounds like if you have set drills where you're trying to get everyone to do the same thing, what happens if someone cannot do the same thing that you're asking everyone to do? Or what, or do you have to explain it in a different way? Is that kind of the question?
I'm hearing what you said about the stretching, for example, that Carol needs to do a different set of stretches than Steve does, or different warm-ups. And so when I'm doing that little conditioning of now we're going to work on agility and balance, that's something I need to take in mind. And I understand that, when I'm talking about second guard, I'm going to focus on this is how it's accomplished and what it's trying to do, not as much on the specific position of your elbow compared to your wrist because of the physiological differences you were mentioning. But how much of an issue have that you seen that be in the drills designed to teach second guard?
I honestly haven't seen a lot of issues because if something, so to second guard, so for explaining, second guard is a great example because if your posture is incorrect, then for a female fighter, then a drill in second guard isn't going to help her very much if she is training in incorrect posture. A drill for a male fighter in second guard, if he has incorrect posture, is not going to get the same feedback. It is still bad for his shoulders. So keeping that in mind, I think that some things are similarities, like posture. So if you start with explaining good posture and running through how to parry in second with good posture, then that should be a drill that works well for everyone. What you want to watch for as an instructor is for somebody who has incorrect posture, for somebody who is either failing the drill repeatedly and then you can give them additional help, figure out why they're failing the drill. Is it their posture? Is it something else? Maybe they have something that is totally different that is causing issues. But also in terms of drills, or in terms of, say, foot placement, that I cannot stand with me personally, I cannot stand with 120-degree angle between my 2 feet. So like we have our 90-degree sport fencing stance. If I pull my foot back here, have 120-degree, which is something that a lot of men in my practice do, I literally cannot stand in this position without cocking my butt out and creating a strong bend in my lower back. This is not a way that I want to fence. This is not a posture that is good for me. So explaining something that has, so footwork drills, for instance, you might run through a variety of options and a variety of ways how someone can place their feet that are all correct, that all include good posture, but gives people options. So it's kind of a multiple choice question rather than this is how we are standing and this is how we're moving. You can say, this is how I'm standing and moving. Here is an equally correct way to stand and move, that if this feels better for you, and if this feels more natural or comfortable, then you can do your footwork drills in that way. And rolling through options that are equally correct while not calling them out as like the weird option. So you don't say like, here is the best option and here is the okay option that if you can't, suck it up for the best option, then here you can do this option B, right? To bring it to an extreme, that instead of saying best option and less good option, you just have option A and option B. For things where you are trying to teach a specific motion, then across, in general, most people are going to be able to do most motions. And you want to make sure that posture is good and start paying attention to the individual. There's honestly not normally so many fighters at a practice or so many new folks at a practice unless you're teaching a large class, that you can't zero in on someone who is struggling. And that could be something to work on as an instructor, is to notice students who are struggling with what you're teaching and being able to help them. Because maybe it's the way you're explaining something rather than the actual motion that's causing an issue. Maybe there are multiple options for a motion and you want to start giving that multiple choice option. That there are a variety of ways that things can be kind of diversified as an explanation, rather than while still staying within most people are doing the same drill category. Did that answer your question?
I think it does. Thank you.
Any additional questions or follow-up questions?
This is kind of a follow-up question to what you were just talking about. You talked about the physiological differences between men and women and accommodating for that in terms of teaching posture and correct stance. What's your viewpoint as an instructor when you have a student with a certain physical memory, either from another sport or another activity? I know you mentioned you dance. When do you kind of say, all right, this physical memory is something that's an asset, let's capitalize on it for fighting, versus, oh, the habits in this particular memory might not be great for fighting, either due to injury or just it's going to limit your motion or whatever? Where do you kind of make those judgment calls?
That's a great question. I think that's hugely individual. As an example from myself, so I have a background in dance. And actually, I'm going to mute you because I think I'm echoing. Thank you, sorry. I have a background in dance. A dance step that I used very commonly is often called a grapevine in one of the folk dances I do, where you step over your feet. So you basically cross your feet like that, right? You don't want to be doing that a lot in a rapier. That's when somebody's going to hit you, is exactly when you're like, your legs are crossed and you are off balance. So that is something that is a physical memory for myself that I had to train out of, specifically for rapier, because I was getting hit a lot. So, so that is, I guess, so that's an example of a physical memory where at a certain point, you do just have to be like, hey, this isn't working out for you. This isn't working out for you. And you might, what you want to do at that point is, if a physical memory is not working out, you want to focus more on drills. You want to back it up and start slowly and be like, okay, here is the replacement motion that is a better motion for the sport that you are currently participating in. And also see if there's ways to kind of have like a psychological barrier between the two sports. If they're still doing the other sport or the other activity, then they might have to have like some type of cue so their brain knows when to do the motion and when not to do the motion. I don't actually have any, that's more to sports psychology. I actually don't have any resources on that, but that's something that could be interesting to look into. In terms of a physical memory that's good, I often actually start that way for a lot of newcomers, that I ask them what their sport or other physical activity backgrounds are. And if I know anything about it, then I try and relate it to the rapier that I'm teaching. I know I have not done horseback riding, but I have friends who have, and they often relate the kind of posture of sitting on a horse for stance in the beginning. Belly dancing, as a dance background for myself, teaches isolationist movements, which is really, really helpful for learning how to make sure that all different parts of your body are aligned in a way that is optimal for the sport that you're participating in. I tend to just ask people their backgrounds. Good physical memories can certainly be capitalized on. Definitely say, hey, so you know X, Y, Z. Yeah, that's very similar to what we're doing here. Bad physical memories have to be trained out and might want to look into sports psychology for how to kind of separate the two if they're still participating. And the other thing I lost it. I had a tangential thought for that, and I completely lost track of it. So, yeah. Any further questions while I try and chase down that tangential thought of mine? Sports backgrounds. Newcomers. Nope, it's gone. Oh well. All right, we're at 9:26, so we've got 4 more minutes left if there are any more questions. Any at all? I know some folks have been popping out. And thank you everyone for coming. Feel free to pop out if you need to.
So I do have a question, and this gets back to the elbow issue I asked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
How do we deal with the different terminology as it pertains to men and women? As an example, when you say hinge at your hips, a woman will understand that. Or when you say your elbow pops out, a woman will understand that. But I'm sitting here with my partner, who is a very accomplished rapier instructor, and David, you were just dying in the corner there. He didn't understand that terminology the way I did because we're used to it. So how do we bridge that communication gap? Because simple terminology makes sense to us, but not to other people.
So Erin Harper and I have a running discussion about the hinge at your hips term, especially. I learned the term hinge at your hips from physical therapy and from like, I'm blanking on the term, but like working out at the gym, from those folks who give like classes and working out at the gym. I suspect it is a more modern term. Erin is actually one of the examples that I will not be that I call out in my presentation. He likes to say bend at the waist when I say hinge at the hips. And I have been continuously yelling at him about this for about a year or so, because that would be why I originally threw out my back. Erin's my teacher, and this is something that I did not understand originally. And I think that the answer that I'm coming to is to use multiple terms. Is to a combination, use multiple terms. And Erin, you might see this in your class that you gave a couple weeks ago, a week ago, time is weird. Use multiple terms and also pay attention to your students to recognize if they're doing something that you have not explained. If you're like, this is how we do the motion, and then they're doing something that is not that motion, then you want to be able to catch that and make sure that they are doing the motion that you explained, even if you have to run through multiple explanations. Maybe you have to pass them off to another teacher. It's another thing. Sometimes people just understand different people differently. You can say the exact same thing, and someone else is going to say it in like, they changed 2 words and maybe their tone, and suddenly the student is like, wow, light bulb moment. And I know that's something that's very frustrating for teachers, but sometimes it's just kind of true that you might just have to be like, all right, we're not getting this. Here, talk to my co-instructor or talk to my friend, and they're going to try and explain the exact same thing in a way that you'll understand. And that also helps cut through the frustration of a student not understanding what the teacher is saying. That I'm definitely a type of student who will ask 1,000,001 questions if I don't understand something. And sometimes that's good and that gets me the answer. And sometimes it just leads to frustration. And in reality, I should be like, cool, great. You said a thing that I don't understand. I'm going to go ask somebody else who I know often talks in a way that I understand a little better or a little differently. And I'm going to ask them the question. That's something that I think is also on students to, instead of running in circles, to just be like, you know, I think I'm not understanding you. I'll try it another day, or I'll ask XYZ person instead. That is both an instructor and a student responsibility to try and understand each other.
No, thank you. That's actually been a question percolating in the back of my head since I took David's class.
Yeah, I'm one of his examples too. But speaking of David's class, I do want to go back as the last question, and then I'm going to stop recording. If folks still have questions they want to throw at me, that's fine. But as the last question was, as men who are instructors and higher level, how do you assist? Do you not assist? Do you assist in different times? Is that exactly what you're asking? Or do you want to rephrase what you're asking?
I think that's about it. I mean, sometimes I feel like you're damned if you do it and you're damned if you don't, right? If I try and chime in and help out, I'm sometimes told, you're not a woman, you don't have the experience, shut the hell up. And sometimes I'm told, well, you need to speak up because you have the experience. So from your point of view, Rachel, how would you tell instructors on how to be an ally, how to help out and to try and get the right direction?
So I would say that I think you're probably correct in the damned if you do, damned if you don't, that there are always going to be people that disagree with the way that you're going about things. I'm sure there are people who disagree with the way that I'm going about things. But I think that in terms of how to be a good ally, that if you're a man and you're speaking up about women fighters, that you do want to check in with your female friends to make sure that you are saying something that in general they agree with. There are always going to be women who disagree with what you're saying because we disagree with each other. We're not a monolith, right? So like I'm going to be saying something and you know, maybe my friend over here is going to be like, yeah, I totally disagree with that. But that doesn't mean that either of us are wrong. People are going to disagree. Maybe we disagree with how to go about things. But as long as you're checking in and you're like, hey, friends, does this make sense to you? Hey, friends, is this a really dumb thing for me to be saying? Then that's something that I think is kind of like your good baseline of if you're checking in with your friends and they're generally on board with what you're saying, then that I would say is one part of being a good ally. And another part is to make sure that that whole talking versus talking over. That you are talking in the space that is your responsibility to talk in, I guess is the best way I'd phrase it, which I'm gonna explain a little more. So for instance, I'm giving this class, right? And there are definitely things that you've talked about in your class. And it's harder to do virtually because it's very clear virtually that I'm the instructor, although that's not always the case. But let's say in an in-person class, you could pop up and you could be raising your hand every 3 seconds. You can say, well, actually, blah, 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 blah. You could be jumping in and giving a lot more examples when I'm the instructor standing up in front of the class, but you're intruding rather than adding to the class. So that would be something that would be the wrong way to go about it. And that would not be being an ally because you would be talking over me in that case. Rather than you want something that'd be talking with me. So for instance, talking with me is you giving your own class, which you've done. And like the way you called me up ahead of time and were like, hey, I know you're teaching this class and you have a lot of information that would be really useful for me to include in my class. Is it cool if I get your notes and include that information? And do you have any other comments you want to send along with it? And then I can choose yes or no, do I send you my notes? But assuming I choose yes, then you are talking with me because you're saying, hey, my friend over here did a lot of research and I'm helping to amplify her research in addition to other things that you're talking about that is just your research and your thoughts and your experiences. So it's my thought for how this all works is that we're all ripples in a pond. And if you throw a stone in a pond, the ripples only go so far that they get smaller and smaller as they get farther away from the stone that you've thrown in the pond. But if you throw multiple stones in the pond, far enough apart, then the ripples will continue across the entire pond. But if instead you throw a handful of throw a handful of stones all in one place, then you're going to get the same number of ripples as that first single stone, but you won't be able to figure out where they are coming from. But they also won't reach as far. So instead you want to be multiple stones thrown into a pond to get those ripples spread as far as possible. So I'm going to end on that note and thank everyone for coming and stop recording.